Perfect. I've had the great privilege this year of writing the 2024 newsletter articles for the museum. We send out a newsletter every month, and I wrote the articles for that, and they were all surrounding the MacDonell House architecture and also the women of the MacDonell House. And next month is going to actually talk about domestic servants that lived in the MacDonell House. So just to give you a little bit of a forewarning about that, foreshadowing. And they always come out on the 10th of every month, just for your information. These women are really interesting. A lot of them were well connected to the Allen County, and especially promoting it through philanthropy. Can't hear me? Okay.
A little louder there.
Sometimes it's just easier if I hold it, but I'm going to try not to, and I'm just going to talk this close to it. So these women really spent their time improving Allen County through their philanthropy, through their connections. But we also have to remember that these women were very privileged. All of these women's husbands made millions of dollars in today's money, and so they were able to live lives that we can't even fathom probably in most cases. And like I just mentioned, they all had domestic servants that cleaned and cooked for them. So their lives are a little bit different than ours are, but all fabulous in their own rights. So, can I shut it off? Yes, I can. So I'd like to introduce you to the 6 women. Mary Banta was the first lady of the house. She was married to Frank Banta, who owned a factory, candy factory and candy merchant store, and that's what he did for a living. They lived in the house from when it was built in 1893 all the way to 97. Emma Van Dyke is the next lady of the house. She was married to John Van Dyke, who really famously started the refinery here under the supervision of Rockefeller. They lived in the house from 1897 to 1903 or 04. It took them a little while to move out of the house, but they would actually own it until 1915. Edna Van Dyke, aka Edna de Lima, never lived in the house, but we tell her story there not only because she was born in Allen County, but because of her connection to John Van Dyke, who was her husband. Ida Hoover would be the next lady that would live in the house. She lived there from 1915 to 1932. Her husband was William F. Hoover, and he owned Hoover and Bond Company furniture store. Next, we have Elizabeth MacDonald. She was a big part of our community. We have a lot of things named after her just here, even because of all the work she did with the Allen County Museum. She would live in the house from 1932 to 42, and her husband, A.T. MacDonald, was part of the oil industry here, as well as a banker. Ellen MacDonald is the last lady of the house. She was married to Jim MacDonald, who was our president for many years, and he was a geologist and worked in the oil business as well. And she lived in the house from 1942 to 1955. One quick mention I have is we do not have any photos of either Mary Banta or Ida Hoover, so I'll be using other supplementary images for them. But we have images of all the rest of the ladies, so you'll be able to see their beautiful faces. Okay, let's start with Mary Banta, who's definitely the most elusive of the ladies still. We just know bits and pieces about her. Obviously, her life was the earliest of all of these at the house. She was born January 20th, 1860 in Troy, Ohio, which many of you probably know is just north of Dayton, Ohio. Her parents were Joseph R. and Sarah John being their last name. My guess has always been that they were farmers based off of the area they lived in, but it's still quite fuzzy what they did with their lives. We don't even actually know the exact date of when Mary married Frank. I just assume it's a little bit before 1879 because they would have their only son, Roy Banta, in 1879. The Banta business grew from a fruit cart to a large candy store, and even at different times they would be selling candy in Australia. That was as far as the business went. Frank is the one case that we know about how much he was making a year. So in the 1906 Allen County history, It is told to us that he made about an average of $150K a year. In our money today, that would be around $5 million. So that just to help you place these people in history. So Mary's life. They built the MacDonell House. They would be the people that would lay the foundation for it in 1893. One of my favorite facts about the house is that the reporters who talked about what the architect was planning to do reported the house is going to be green. I believe this is a misunderstanding because the tiling on the first 2 floors and this roof is slate, and I believe they just thought it was going to be the normal slate green color, but it was always the orange color that it is today. And this is just a rendering of what I thought it might look like if it was green, which I very much so enjoy. Oral history tells us something pretty interesting about Mary, that she was afraid of electricity. Just to give that a little bit of context, electricity wasn't common in homes until about 1920s in America, and that was only in half the homes. So this is about 30 years before this, that the MacDonell House was built with electricity and running water. So they were way ahead of the time, and it was just because they were so close to the refinery that they had these luxuries, and they could pay for them, of course, too. So many of the light fixtures in the house, and the ones that are still remaining, have both gas lighting and, I think did it go out?
I think it went out.
Yeah.
This darn thing. Thank you guys. Just tell me if I need to move it and I'll move it, okay? So many of the light fixtures in the house have both electric lighting and also gas lighting. The breakfast chandelier, the front hall, and then there's one in the butler pantry that I've seen too. I'm sure there's other ones in the house, but those are the ones that I've noticed walking through. The house was a little bit smaller than it is today at their time. It was about 2/3 the size of what it is today. And they threw a housewarming party with about 100 guests right after they moved in. Just to put that in perspective, we don't throw parties over 36 people today. But we normally do sit down, so we need them to be able to sit at a table spot. 36 of them is about what we do. Because I did Mary's article first, I decided to go back with some of the other resources that I found along the way to do a little bit more research about her. Those resources mainly being newspapers.com and ancestry.com to learn about what had been written about her in newspaper articles of that time. So one of the main things I found was that Mary often traveled to Troy to see her family. We would see this a lot with the other women, but I think it's kind of sweet that she went home often and got to see her family. The other thing I learned about her is that in 1882, she went on a trip to the East Coast. And so it did seem like Frank went on that trip with her. I think she just went with friends and family. And the other thing to note is it's only 3 years after Boy's War. So good for her, she went on the trip all by herself, right after the baby was born. Not right after, but pretty soon after. And just like many of the MacDonell households, as I probably won't talk about at length, she hosted a lot of visitors would stay at the house. The MacDonell House has a lot of guest bedrooms, and so a lot of people stayed over for all of the families. They were often a host family. The last thing that I learned was that in 1894, Mary contracted malarial fever. We had always known, unfortunately, that Mary had gotten ill pretty early in life. She had been marked as being ill of health throughout most of the 1890s, according to her obituary, and that she never really gets better. She had 2 surgeries during the 1890s, trying to do what? We never get an answer for, unfortunately. But we do know that the last surgery was in Chicago, and she would contract blood poisoning during that surgery, and that would lead to her ultimate death at a very young age. She passed away July 3rd, 1900. One of the things I mentioned to you guys was that she had only lived in the house until 97. They actually switched houses in 97 with the Van Dykes, downsizing a house, but we know that by 1900, they had been living in an apartment complex
instead with a bunch of other families. So it's brought us the question of, did they lose a lot of money to medical bills, or was her ill health just caused them not to be able to take care of a household, basically? And unfortunately, we'll never get that answer. Okay. So that is unfortunately the sad and early end of Mary Vanta. Moving on to Emma Van Dyke. Emma was born in either 1854 or 55 in Pennsylvania. Her father's name was Austin Grimes. I was not able to find her mother's name, but her mother was with her on her deathbed because she also passes a little bit early in age. We'll get to that eventually. We know next to nothing about her youth until she becomes of age that she can work for the U.S. Government Pension Bureau. The Pension Bureau was one of the biggest government agencies from about the Civil War until World War I. They helped veterans financially, especially after the Civil War. There was many wounded veterans, and it was one of the ways that the U.S. helped those people be able to live even as they were wounded. She was either a bookkeeper or a secretary there. We don't know how John or Emma met. He was working in an oil field in Pennsylvania near where she lived at that time, so our best guess is that they met each other just while they were living in Pennsylvania and fell in love. They got married in 1889 and would move straight away to Lima, where John would be setting up the refinery under the guise of Rockefeller. So that was what they did really quickly into their marriage, like that year. I think she's kind of the American dream story of she went from being this secretary, bookkeeper, to being part of the Lima upper crust. Like most women of the MacDonell House, she did a lot of charity work. She was very involved in her church, the Market Street Presbyterian. They held a few charity concerts actually at their house to raise money for the church. She was also on the women's board for the Lima Hospital Society, and that's when there was first money being raised for the hospital to start. So she was on the ground floor of that, and she also helped start the YWCA chapter in Lima. One of the things that's always been assumed about Emma that I unfortunately couldn't find any definitive answers about was that she was well-traveled. We've known for some time that John Van Dyke was well-traveled. Not only was he an oil man going to different places for his job, but he had a lot of fun doing it. A lot of our our more exotic things here were donated by him. Most of the stuff in our Asian collection was, as well as a lot of like marble statues that we have. I always say if you see it and it's marble, it's from Van Dyke. So we had assumed always that Emma was also well-traveled, but I couldn't find any evidence of that, unfortunately, in any news articles. And a lot of times that was something that they liked to talk about, the upper crust of Lima going somewhere and doing something exciting. The legacy that I think Emma holds today, or the one that we like to touch on the most, was the big parties that they threw at the house. There was a tea for 400 women that she held in 1898, and this is before the house was renovated. So it's still 2/3 the size. All I have to say is I hope it was an indoor-outdoor party. Again, she did those music concerts from her church. I think most of them were done in the parlor, which is not a very big space for an entire concert if you've ever been inside the house. Another big party she held right after the expansion was done. She had 150 couples, so 300 people at this party, and I believe it was in like the middle of the winter too, so it was not an indoor-outdoor party. That was another huge party she held. My favorite thing about that one is they hired two different musical groups. One of them was a regional harpist from around the Dayton area, and he played in the waiting room, so right when you walk into the MacDonell House, he would be playing there. And then they had an orchestra playing up in the ballroom for people to dance. And I did a lot of research trying to figure out where this orchestra was from, because they were called Frey's Orchestra. If you read the article, I went on a whole thing with that one, but my best guess is that they were a New York-based orchestra. One of the greatest things that they did there was significantly expand the house. And I have a newsletter just all about that. Like I just mentioned, Emma passed a little bit earlier in life than anyone could have hoped for someone. So Standard Oil would send John back to Pennsylvania in around 1903-04. It took them a little while to move out of the house. And they find out the July of 1904 that she has a fatal heart condition. There's no lead up to that other than that fact in her obituary, and she would pass away on November 27th, 1904. She was buried at West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Pennsylvania. She was very well remembered by the people of Lima. Several of her close friends traveled to Pennsylvania for her funeral, and her obituary ran in the Lima newspaper as well as the Pennsylvania one. So moving on to the next lady, Edna Van Dyke, or Edna de Lima. We have a lot more information about Edna compared to the last two women, so I'll try and go through it a little bit quickly. Just know that there's a lot of information about her, and the newsletter is a little bit more expansive than I was able to be here. One of the rumors I first learned when touring the house was that Emma and John were seen as having raised or financially supported Emma during her youth. I couldn't find any evidence of that. I think there might be a little bit of confusion because her mother's name is Emma Burton, and that might have gotten confused between Emma Burton and Emma Van Dyke. And they went to the same church, and they had connections, obviously, but she was not financially dependent on them or raised by them, according to the research that I looked through. So starting with Edna's life. She was born July 15th in 1878 or 9 in Westminster, Ohio. So she's an Allen County girl. Her parents were Dr. Enos and Emma Burton. And when she was 10, she started I think she met the love of her life, music. She took music lessons on the organ and the piano. And then not soon after that, they would move to Lima officially, and she would start singing at the choir in the Market Street Presbyterian Church. Edna would go to Lima College for her college degree and earn her degree in voice and piano. Pretty quickly after that, she would move to New York City, where she was taught by several teachers, but really spent her time raising money for herself through singing at churches so she could go to her ultimate goal, which was to move to Paris. And she would do that in 1907 to be taught opera by a Polish opera singer named Jean de Risquet. He had gotten sick a few years before that, and like many opera singers of the time, when he retired, he started teaching other students. And he would be the one actually that would help her pick out her stage name, Edna de Lima, after her hometown, like one of his other star pupils who's even more famous than Edna, who is Nellie Melba. She was named after Melbourne, Australia, which is her hometown. You will notice that it is pronounced Lima, like Lima, Peru, instead of Lima, like our hometown is. That was just a mispronunciation, and that was how she was known, with that pronunciation. Okay, so let's go on to her career. I tried to condense this to just the important facts again. But her breakout role was in 1910, playing in La Boheme at the Royal Opera Covent Garden in London, England. This is actually a picture of her in character for that. She would do several shows there a season, and then do several performances of each show during the season too. So she was a very busy lady. She, up until the point of World War I, she would do her summer seasons at the Royal Opera Covent Garden, England, and then do her winter seasons at the Vienna Imperial Opera in Munich, Germany. So she would be doing several shows per year at both those places and several performances of each show. Very busy. It wasn't until, and then when World War I hit, she actually had to flee back to the United States because she had been in Munich at the time of it starting. Not long after returning to America, Edna would get a new instructor named Madame Marcella. She's probably the most famous of the opera singers that we're going to talk about now. She has a whole museum in Australia about her. She was a retired former opera singer just as well and taught her. It takes Edna a little bit more time to break out on the stage in the US. She would do a show in New York City that wasn't to much acclaim, take a few months off, study up with Marcella, and then try again, and this time she was a lot more well-liked. One of the issues that she had from the very beginning in the US is she sang a lot of German operas, and because of World War I, those weren't well-liked. But by 1917, she had signed with a management group and was doing tours of the East America and then Midwest America. And that's when she did her one show in Memorial Hall here, was during that tour. In 1921, she would head back to Europe again, really where she wanted to live, and do a summer season in Italy. By 22, she's back to doing what she had been before, Royal Opera Covent Garden in the summer, and then Munich in the winter. 1923, she hits the most countries of her career to that point. She sang in several Scandinavian countries, actually did a real show in France instead of just practicing there, and sang in Belgium. Her two most special tours would happen in 26 and 30. In 26, she goes on a tour in the south of Africa. So not South Africa, the country, but just in the southern part of Africa. And then in 30, she would sing in Japan and China. And we know that during the Japanese program, she was accompanied by a Japanese orchestra and sang with them. And that's when she retired after that in 1930. So Edna's personal life, a little less easy to follow. She doesn't keep any diaries or anything, so a lot of the stuff is missing information or information we couldn't find, and reading between the lines of that. She marries John Van Dyke in 1908 in August, to the surprise of nearly everyone. They travel back on the Cecile, which is that model boat we have out there. It was actually the model boat he gave her for her 1-year anniversary. She didn't like it, but we have it today. It's really hard to follow John and Edna's movements, and it doesn't seem like they're in the same place very often. Some new information I found while doing the domestic servants research was the 1910 census of John's house. In it, he gives Edna's name, age, that she can read and write, all the normal information, but written in where her occupation slot would be, and like the other places, it's written by the census taker that the head of household wouldn't answer any more questions about this person. So we're starting to see that not even 2 years later, it's getting rocky already for their marriage. And in no surprise to anyone, in 1919, John files for divorce on the grounds of desertion. The grounds of desertion, divorce basically means that he believes Edna deserted his marriage by not living with him even though he wanted her to. The divorce would be finalized in 1921, and neither of them would remarry after that. Edna, while not being close to John, was very close with her nuclear family, Burns. It's pretty easy to follow through newspaper articles that they're together often, even when she's living abroad for decades of her life. In the early 1920s, the Burtons had a really hard few years, losing Don, her only brother, to PTSD from World War I, and then losing Dr. Burton to an illness. She would come home for the funerals, even though she lived abroad at that time. She was very close to her youngest sister, Helen. They would travel a lot together, whether it be in Europe or America. I really liked that because I'm very close with my younger sister. Okay, so now the end of Edna's life. A very happy note. Edna would live a long, happy life, not passing so early like both Mary and Emma did. She would live between New York, Paris, and London for decades. We know for sure that she had houses in London and New York. We don't know if she really had an apartment in Paris or just traveled there often. She would retire in 1930, like I mentioned, and then by 1962, she moves to Connecticut to be closer to friends and family. In 68, she would pass away in a nursing home in Mystic, Connecticut. She was cremated, and her ashes were spread on a nature preserve in Sunbury, Massachusetts. That's just about 45 minutes west of Boston. So Ida Hoover. Again, we don't have an image of Ida, so I'll be using other supplementary images. She was born February 1st, 1869 in Shawnee Township, another Allen County girl. Her parents were Salem and Adelia, better known as Addie Reed. She would get married to William F. Hoover in 1893, and they would have 2 daughters, Aline and Pauline. Their names are very similar, which got confusing to say the least. I'm still actually not sure. I think Aline's older and then Pauline's the younger one, and they're about a year off in age. The Hoover family members, the 4 of them, were very tight-knit. Both girls' husbands would actually work for Hoover and Bond Co., being the vice president and the treasurer. Pauline, both the girls named their sons after William, actually, so their firstborns were both William, and then one of them went by Billy for his whole life. Pauline named her daughter Aline, see the names. Aline named her daughter Adelia after her grandmother. And pretty much in all the research I did, whether it was a party or a trip, they're together. 3 or 4 of them together all the time. Okay, so what's Ida's life look like? Unlike Mary and Emma, Ida doesn't throw parties. She goes to parties. I called her a party goer, not a party thrower. The only party I was able to find that she threw was at the Shawnee Country Club, actually, and it was for Frank Banta's daughter-in-law from his second wife. So not Roy's wife, but one of his other son's wives, which I thought was a really cute connection, actually. Just like all of them, she did a lot of philanthropy. Mostly she did work with the Lima City Hospital. She was a treasurer on their board for several years and ran for several years a money drive that was with the Boys and Girl Scouts. Another really interesting thing about her is that she owned and sold land a lot. I could find this through special taxes that were on land that she had bought, but also that she bought homes off of auction. And in this last picture, you can see her mom actually owned land too. So Addie and Salem are up there, and Addie owned 40 acres and Salem owned 40. So I didn't know if it was a family thing, owning land. But William would also own a lot of land, and we'll kind of come back to that soon. The Hoover and Bond Co., like I mentioned, was a really big part of their lives. All of them worked for it. Ida would actually be on the paperwork for when Hoover and Bond Co. first got stocks. So she was as liable as her husband or their lawyers or anything. And she would get a more prominent position in 1935 when she would become the president of the company. The most interesting thing about Ida, in my opinion, is there were a lot of law cases she was a part of. She sued 2 people and then was sued twice during her life. So she would sue her brother for her parents' land after they passed away. It was in Shawnee, and he was living in Cleveland, so I don't know if it was, it's closer to me, I should own it, or what really happened there, but she sued him for that land. She would sue her ex-son-in-law next, Val Cole, who was a piece of work, like, everything I read about this guy. So she had given him a family ring to be his wedding band when he got married to her daughter. And he didn't want to give it back after they got divorced. So she sued him, and it was a several-year thing, and he moved to California during it, and it was a mess. But I think she might have actually got it back in the end. We'll hope for her case. Then her and William were sued near the end of the 1920s, early 30s, for some land that they had owned in Bath Township that they had never paid the bank back for. My thoughts on this are mismanagement during the 1920s, to say the least, but I think they were greatly hit by the Great Depression as a company. And this is really shown to us by the next law case, which is during the liquidation of Hoover and Bond Co. They actually sued for a retrial to get some of the money from the liquidation and not give it all back to their creditors. They would lose that case. So I'm really like, I don't know the exact reasons, it could have been mismanagement, but I think that the very end of Ida's life. So they would sell the house to Elizabeth MacDonald in, I think I just, is it working out? Yeah. In 1932, they would sell the house to Elizabeth MacDonald. And through doing some of that census information that I was talking about for the domestic servants, we learned that in 1930 they didn't have domestic servants, even though they had in 1920. So I think we see this gradual, like, them having less and less money at the end of the 1920s through that. Again, talking about the Hoover and Bond Co. going out of business during the mid-1930s. William would get pretty ill in about 1934 to 35, and unfortunately passed September of 1937. I think this might have been one of the reasons why she was the president for a little while as well, just because he couldn't step up to the plate anymore, but he trusted his wife to do that. And then Ida starts getting sick not long after he passes away. She would be admitted to St. Rita's during January of 1938. The newspaper doesn't say what's ailing her, and neither does her obituary that would come out then after she passes March of 1938. Her will and Williams didn't hold a lot of money nor land for the girls, which I think is another thing to show that they had really lost funds during this time, based on how much holdings they had early in the 1920s in comparison. Ida's really the one we knew the least about beforehand, and she was really fun to discover and find out a little bit more about her. Next, our next lady of the house. So Elizabeth MacDonald was born February 27th, 1865 in Lima on the corner of Elizabeth and North Street. I was never able to figure out which corner of Elizabeth and North Street. Her parents were James Ross Dalzell and Harriet Elizabeth Cheney Dalzell. She went to school in both Lima and Fort Wayne during her youth, and she would be taught piano in Fort Wayne and be considered a child wonder on the piano, playing a performance in Chicago. Unfortunately, after that, we don't get a lot of mentions of her piano playing, other than we know she played at her church, the First Baptist Church of Lima, quite often. But that kind of just doesn't come up again, unfortunately. After she graduated from high school, Elizabeth taught at the Lima School for a few years until she met A.T. MacDonald, Alexander Thomas MacDonald. He had called her the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and they were married August 27th, 1890. He had been born in Ontario, lived in both Canada and America, moving around a lot because he was in the oil business as well as being a banker. And he was said in one of the things I read to always have owned a farm as well. They would go on to have 4 sons, Duncan, George, Alexander, who went by A.D., I think probably to situate himself from his father, and then James, who is better known as Jim. So I'll be calling them A.D. and Jim from now on. Very sadly, Duncan would pass away in 1918 from the Spanish influenza while he served in World War I. George would die in 1923 at a young age also in a car accident near Findlay. He had been married at the time and had 1 son. Elizabeth actually I think it was like 5 or 6 years later, with her sister, would hold the wedding of George's wife, a widow, when she got remarried. So I thought that was very sweet. And around the same time, in the early 1920s, is when A.T. MacDonald passes away as well. So that was a very sad decade for the family. A.D. married Mary Wynn. He was a banker, and they had 3 children. And then Jim married Ellen Mead, and they had 3 children as well, but we'll be talking about them next since Ellen is the last lady of the house. So Elizabeth's life. Elizabeth was a very big part of her community. She was a very important lady. She was part of all the big events and hosted a lot of said big events during her life. It seemed like at points in her life, either she's hosting an event at her place of residence or at the Shawnee Country Club,
once a month. And when I was doing research for any of the other ladies, her name came up all the time as one of the people that went to the parties or a host for something. So even if I'm looking up Ida Hoover, Elizabeth MacDonald is going to be in there, which I found really sweet. She was especially known for her charity work. The Allen County Museum has a lot to thank from her and the charity work she did in helping us become a museum with our own building. She was also on the Lima City Hospital Board for several years, specifically when they bought their new land and changed the name to Memorial. She was a part of that transition and played a key part in it. She was also on the Lima Library Board for many years. Her specialty was in conservation of objects and books. And then she helped on a special board for the Red Cross during World War II. That was all about what to do on the home front, and she was a big part of that board. One of the great loves of her life was the First Baptist Church. She taught Sunday school there for many years, played the piano at the church. She was also known as one of their very sage elders. In everything I read, it was noted as she's the one to go to if you have a question, you want to hear someone's advice, because it's going to be sound advice. And also, she donated money for a chapel to be built there after she passed away. My favorite thing about Elizabeth's life is that she's the queen of Lima clubs. I have crowned her this. Though Ellen could be running for this, I'm just going to say that now. But she was a part of at least 8 clubs that she would go to monthly. She would give presentations at, she would just visit, and I couldn't imagine trying to juggle 8 clubs. I'm a part of one. Some of them were hobby clubs, like the garden club. She was really well known for her gardening and her love of it. And others, I would say the majority of them, were really focused on philosophical discussion between women. My favorite one was the Ultramarine Club, which I talk more about in the newsletter article. And she was also known as one of the people that you wanted to come talk at your club. If you needed a lecturer, you call Elizabeth MacDonald, and she'll probably talk about culture or the traveling she does, or has done. She was really quite an interesting woman, and that segues us really wonderfully into how she was a world traveler. Her biggest trip of her life was an 11-month around the world tour with her son Jim in 1926 to 27. We know during that time that she went to Egypt, China, Israel, South America. They were busy. I got to look at some records that we have of one of her lectures. That's her talking about what she did in Egypt and China specifically. Really interesting. And just to see someone's view of that during 1920s is, I think, kind of remarkable. She would also visit Mexico several times, and just Central America. She did a trip up the Yukon, Alaskan coast to the Yukon, and then she did a visit to the southern states with Mary MacDonald. She's known as traveling all the time. She also had real estate interests. She would buy the MacDonell House on Cole Street. The family would still live there for about the next year, I think, paying rent to her. I couldn't really figure that out. And eventually that would be the house that A.D. and Mary, and plus their family, would live in. So I don't know if she gave it to them or if they bought it off of her, but that was the family connection there. She, of course, buys the MacDonell House and lives in there for about 10 years. And then there's a lot of other random real estate purchases and transfers throughout her life. Luckily for all of the people of Lima, Elizabeth has a really long and happy and healthy life for the most part. She keeps going to the very end. The last year of her life, 1942, would be the year that she would do that Alaskan coast trip. And she would do several presentations about it to other clubs and just still participate in everything up until about October of that year, when she would have what we think is a stroke today. And she was bedridden until she passed away December 14th, 1942. At that time, she would have been 82, almost 83. And she was buried at Woodland Cemetery. If I haven't mentioned up until this point where they were buried, it was probably Woodland Cemetery, because most of the people that lived in the MacDonell House were buried there. She really has an enduring memory. I would say almost the most enduring of all these women. Dang this thing. Because she has a memorial library at the museum, and then she has her memorial chapel at the First Baptist Church. So definitely a woman well remembered by the area. Okay. Last but certainly not least, Ellen MacDonald. She was born Ellen Orpha Mead in Randolph, Vermont on August 4th, 1904. The youngest of all the ladies by a lot. Her parents were John F. Mead and Florence Hughes Mead. John had owned a cattle brand business for about 50 years by the time he would pass away, and was also a part of the California state government for many years of his life. You probably recognize Florence's maiden name, Hughes. Her grandfather was John Hughes, who was the mayor of Lima during the Civil War. And John Hughes would also go on to build the Hughes Ruckle Mansion, which used to be across the street and used to hold the YWCA, which a lot of people remember quite fondly. Florence was very similar to Elizabeth MacDonald. I like to call her the Hollywood version, because they lived in Hollywood. She was really the leader of civil and cultural affairs in Hollywood at the time. And they had been best friends for their whole entire lives. So this is really how I believe Jim and Ellen met through their parents. So going back to Ellen's life, she would live in Vermont until she was around the age of 9 when her whole family moved to Hollywood. She would graduate from high school there in 1919, and then start almost immediately at a prep school called Dana Hall in Massachusetts. And she would graduate from there in 1920. She started her college career at Mills College before transferring to Stanford University. And it was there that she would graduate in 1924 with a major in history, which I think I liked a lot because it really shows that she's already interested in that at a young age. And this is actually an image of her from her yearbook photo at Stanford University. That I was able to find on Ancestry.com. A few years later, she would marry Jim MacDonald on June 12, 1936, and they would have 3 daughters together, Anne, Gay, and Janet. So Ellen's life. Ellen is notably very close to her family, visiting her family in Hollywood quite often during her life, being close to Jim's family. Mary, Elizabeth, and Ellen did a lot together. They were a part of a lot of the same clubs and would host events together quite often. And just like Elizabeth, Ellen was also well-traveled. The condensed version I chose to include because she had gone on so many trips during her life was the 1964 family holiday calendar that we have. So in March of 1964, she would go to Texas and Louisiana with Gay and Jim on a work plus pleasure trip. Then in October, they would start on one of the biggest trips of their life with both Janet and Gay, going to New Zealand, the South Pacific Isles, and Australia. They're still traveling in November, where they go to several Asian countries, notably China and Japan. And then guess what? They're still traveling in December. They go to Hawaii before getting back to Lima just in time for Christmas to spend with Anne's family, Christmas Day. So I think that's a really good snapshot into how they traveled, and lucky ducks, that's all I have to say. She was also a society lady like most of the people we've talked about here. But I found her connections to be more commonly through the parties, through the clubs that she was a part of. Notably, she was part of the TNT Club, which is actually a unisex club, and Jim was a part of it too, and he was the president of it for many years. She was a part of the Delphian Club, the Art Study Club, the AAUW, Pi Beta Phi sorority, League of Women Voters, YWCA, and the First Baptist Church is Hannah Circle. she would give speeches a lot, or give lectures or presentations a lot as well. Mostly she talked about motion picture topics because of her growing up in Hollywood, and also arts and culture from all the travel that they did. Not only was she a great patron of the Allen County Museum, giving us the MacDonell House, and so many of our collections were from Jim and Ellen. She also spent a lot of time helping the First Baptist Church. They had a huge debt liquidation campaign in 1960s, and Jim was the president of the campaign, but she gave a lot of the talks about it too, to help raise money. Many of the cultural and charity groups of Lima would get helped by her. Specifically, the Junior Service League and their follies, often she would help with things. The community chest. If any of you guys know about the Lima Convalescent Home, her and Jim were actually two of the first people to donate to the start of it. And once it did start, she was the first treasurer. And she did that for several years. And then the YWCA did get a lot of her time and focus as well. Ellen also lived a good long life and was still a part of many Lima affairs up until the end. Jim would pass away on June 23rd, 1991. Ellen would be doing well in health until 98 when she became ill, and she passed away August 12th, 1999. She was survived by her 3 daughters, 10 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren, and I can only assume that number is skyrocketed since. And one of the last things in her obituary you will read is that all memorial contributions were to go to the MacDonell House Fund for the Lima Community Foundation or the First Baptist Church. So she really still believed in the philanthropic things that she had spent so much of her life focusing on. So yeah, those are the 6 women of the MacDonell House. Thank you so much for coming. I just have one question for you. Do you have any questions? Yes.
So, Edna de Lima and Ellen MacDonell, are they the only 2 women of the house that had degrees?
Yes, they are.
They are?
Yep. Yeah, I got the question was, are Edna de Lima and Ellen the only 2 that had college degrees? And the answer is yes, they were the only 2 that went to college. Oh, yes, duh.
Are you preparing a talk like this on how the house was renovated and gifted to be presented like it is now?
I haven't.
I would love that.
Yeah, I think that could be something I could put together pretty easily, just because of all the research. But yeah, I could do that. The last newsletter article, the November one, was actually about how Anne MacDonell and Ellen had put it together to turn it into a Victorian house once more. Yeah.
These newsletters, do you put them on Facebook or?
They are all on Facebook. The easiest way to find them, though, would be to go to the Allen County Museum's website, and then there's a tab at the top that's just newsletters, and all of them are scrollable down from there. Yeah. And if anyone wants to give your emails at the front, that information will be put into and then you'll get sent our newsletter articles once a month. We don't send a lot of things, so I would greatly suggest it if you're interested in topics about Lima and Allen County. Almost said Lima County.
My email for that always comes, it just says from Donna.
Yeah.
So if they get it and
Yeah, if it says it's from Donna Collins, we've been having difficulty changing the email to our Allen County one,
Okay.
unfortunately. But yeah, Donna Collins is our bookkeeper, and we send them out of hers for right now. Any other questions, or, I mean, you can ask me them less formally now.